Welcome to Cluster Fudge, the podcast that unravels the mess, one thread at a time. I'm your host, Alexandra, and today we're turning our attention to a place that often gets overlooked in national conversations, forgotten in headlines and stereotyped beyond recognition: rural America. This episode is titled Rural America, the True Backbone of America, and I say that with no hesitation, because while urban centres may get the glamour, the innovation headlines, and the media attention, rural America has been quietly doing the work that keeps this country running. From farming and food supply to energy production, military service, cultural heritage and raw resilience, rural America is not just some flyover zone. It's the heart and soul of the nation. Let's dig in. Let's start by unpacking a common myth, the idea that rural means outdated, behind the times, or less important. It's a stereotype that's embedded in media, pop culture, and even public policy. When people hear the word rural, they might picture dusty roads, empty fields, maybe an aging population with few jobs and fewer prospects. But let's get this straight. Rural doesn't mean irrelevant, it means essential. Rural communities make up 97% of the land area of the United States. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans lives in a rural area. That's over 60 million people. These aren't just numbers. These are families, workers, farmers, teachers, entrepreneurs, veterans, small-town doctors and local leaders, all contributing to the nation's well-being in ways that often go unseen and underappreciated. Let's look at just a few sectors where rural America shows up, not just as participants, but as backbones. Number 1, agriculture and food security. Rural America quite literally feeds the nation. About 90% of US agricultural production happens in rural regions. The fruits, vegetables, grains, dairy and meat that stock grocery stores in urban centres, they come from rural communities. These are the people who rise before the sun to harvest, irrigate and care for the land and livestock, even while facing economic uncertainty, trade disruptions and climate challenges. Without rural farmers, there is no food security, period. Rural regions are also the engine rooms of American energy, whether it's natural gas, oil, wind, solar, biofuels, coal or hydropower. Much of it is sourced or generated in rural America. The vast open lands of the Midwest are home to sprawling wind farms. The Appalachian region still supplies the US with significant coal and natural gas. And states like Texas, Iowa and North Dakota are leading in renewable energy, all driven by rural-based production. This means rural America is not stuck in the past, it's powering both the present and the future. Did you know that rural Americans are disproportionately represented in the US military? While they make up around 17 to 19% of the population, they contribute over 30% of active duty personnel. That's a staggering figure, and it speaks volumes about the values of service, duty and sacrifice that are deeply embedded in rural life. Many small towns have long traditions of military service. It's common to see American flags lining rural main streets, names of fallen heroes etched in local monuments, and entire communities rallying to support their veterans. Cultural heritage, American identity, its folklore, music, literature, values, has deep roots in rural life. Country music, bluegrass, gospel, folk. These genres were born in rural hills and hollers. American literature and cinema are filled with themes of small-town pride, family farms, and rural resilience. And let's not forget the values rural communities have championed for generations: self-reliance, hard work, neighbourly support, faith, family. These aren't just clichés. They're lived, practiced traditions in thousands of communities across the country. Why invisible doesn't mean unimportant. So why are these contributions often invisible to urban Americans? Part of the answer lies in media bias. Most major news outlets, entertainment platforms and policy think tanks are headquartered in big cities. Urban narratives dominate and rural voices get drowned out. Then there's the political divide. Rural and urban communities often vote differently, live differently, and view each other through a lens of misunderstanding. But that divide doesn't mean one side is obsolete or out of touch. It means we need more dialogue, more representation, and more respect. Because when you look past the stereotypes, it becomes clear. Rural America is not a relic of the past. It's a foundation of the present. So the next time someone suggests that rural areas don't matter or that small towns are just dying out, ask them this. Who's growing your food? Who's keeping the power on? Who's sending their sons and daughters to serve and protect the country? The answer, more often than not, will point straight to rural America, and that's not irrelevant, that's irreplaceable. If there is one role that makes rural America completely indispensable, one duty that quite literally sustains the country day after day, it's agriculture. The food we eat, the fibres that make our clothes, the grains that feed our livestock, and even the biofuels that help power our vehicles. Much of it originates in the fields, farms, and pastures of rural America. Let's say it plainly, rural America feeds the nation, and increasingly, rural America helps feed the world. But here's the twist. Even though food is central to our survival, we often take the people who grow it for granted. So in this segment, we're digging deep into the realities of rural agriculture, the backbone of the US economy, the culture, and the very dinner table. Start with this staggering figure. Over 2 million farms span the United States, the overwhelming majority of them in rural areas. Of these, more than 98% are family-owned. That's right, not giant corporate conglomerates, but actual families. Generations who have lived on the land, worked it, fought to keep it, and passed it down with pride. These farmers grow corn, the US is the world's top producer, wheat, soybeans, cotton, vegetables and fruit, dairy and beef, poultry, eggs, pork, and more. Agriculture and its related industries contribute over $1 trillion annually to the US economy. That's about 5.5% of GDP, and it's driven by farmers, ranchers, and laborers out in the countryside. Rural America is not just feeding our population of 330 million, it's feeding billions globally through exports that stretch across every continent. 2. The invisible labour behind every bite. We don't see the 4 a.m. wake-up calls to check irrigation systems. We don't see the hours spent in scorching sun or freezing cold tending crops or livestock. We don't see the anxiety of unpredictable weather, fluctuating market prices, pest outbreaks, or rising fertiliser costs. What we do see? That shiny apple in the supermarket, that loaf of bread, that gallon of milk. But those items represent an enormous amount of invisible labour, often done by people who live paycheck to paycheck. Farmers don't just produce. Every season is a gamble against droughts, floods, early frosts, trade wars or inflation. One bad year can wipe out an entire operation. Yet they show up season after season, year after year, with resilience that's honestly heroic. Let's also challenge the outdated image of the old white man on a tractor. Today's American farmer is increasingly diverse and increasingly tech-savvy. Women now make up over 36% of US farmers, with many leading innovative operations. Black, Latino, and Indigenous farmers are growing in number despite historical discrimination in land ownership and credit access. Many younger farmers are returning to the land, often with backgrounds in science, engineering, or sustainability, bringing smart farming technologies like drones, soil sensors, AI-driven crop forecasting, GPS-guided tractors, regenerative farming techniques. This is not old-timey work. It's advanced, and it's critical to climate solutions. And for the global stakes of US agriculture, America exports billions of dollars worth of food every year, including soybeans to China, corn to Mexico, and wheat to Africa and the Middle East. This makes American agriculture a geopolitical force. If US agriculture collapses or contracts too far, global hunger spikes. If our food chain is disrupted, so is the economy, which means the health and resilience of rural agricultural communities is a matter of national and international security. And yet, farm bankruptcies are rising. Land is being sold to corporate developers or foreign investors. Climate extremes are taking a toll. Suicide rates among farmers are tragically high. So the people we depend on most are often the least supported. High five. Food doesn't just appear, it's cultivated. Let's never forget, food doesn't come from a store. It comes from land, labour, and love. The packaging and shelves and Uber Eats deliveries, that's the end of the process. The beginning? A seed planted in a rural field, a calf born in a rural barn, a farmer checking the skies for rain. Rural America isn't behind, it's behind the scenes. And without it, America doesn't eat. To dismiss rural America is to dismiss your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, It's to forget the farmer who rises before dawn so you can have strawberries in January. It's to forget the rancher who sacrifices sleep to birth calves in the dead of winter. Feeding a nation and much of the world is no small feat, and it deserves respect, it deserves gratitude, it deserves protection. Because rural America doesn't just grow crops, it grows stability, and that makes it the most vital engine of all. If there's one thread woven deeply into the fabric of rural America, it's service, especially military service. Rural towns with their tight-knit communities, strong values and cultural emphasis on duty have long been the quiet powerhouse behind America's armed forces. Today, we're diving into a truth that doesn't make headlines often enough. Rural Americans serve in disproportionately high numbers. They fight, they bleed, they sacrifice, and many never come home. So in this segment, we're unpacking why rural communities send so many of their sons and daughters to war, what they gain and what they lose in return, and why this invisible contribution to the nation deserves far more recognition than it gets. Want the numbers? Who's serving America? Let's start with hard data. While only about 17% of Americans live in rural areas, these communities provide 44% of the military's recruits. That's nearly half of the US military, coming from a fraction of the population. By contrast, the most affluent, most urban areas of the country are the least likely to serve. That imbalance is striking, but it's not random. It reflects a long-standing cultural, economic, and moral structure that defines rural life, one where duty, patriotism, honor, and community loyalty still mean something. 2. Why do so many rural Americans serve? There's no one reason. There are many, and they often overlap. A. Cultural values of duty and patriotism. In rural households, military service is often seen not only as a respectable path, but as a moral obligation. Serve your country, earn your place, give back before you ask. These aren't abstract slogans. They're spoken around dinner tables, etched into the memorials in small town squares, woven into school ceremonies and church sermons. Service is passed down like a family heirloom. Grandpa fought in Korea, Dad served in Vietnam, now the grandson enlists in the Marines. Military stories are part of the oral history of rural life, and that continuity gives rural youth a sense of identity and pride. In some cases, enlistment isn't only about patriotism, it's about practicality. Many rural towns face shrinking job markets, failing factories, underfunded colleges or trade schools. For some, the military offers stable income, healthcare, education benefits, GI Bill, a way out of generational poverty. So for thousands, military service is both a calling and a ladder, a way to rise. 3. Small towns, big sacrifices. Here's what gets lost in the national narrative. When rural soldiers don't come home, the impact is enormous. In a small town with 1,200 people, the loss of one soldier doesn't ripple, it reverberates like a cannon blast. The grocery clerk was their cousin. The mailman coached them in Little League. The mayor taught them in high school. Everyone feels it. The whole town shows up to the funeral. Flags are lowered. Streets are lined with people. There's no anonymity in rural sacrifice. It's personal. It's communal. It's deep. 4. Underserved and overlooked after service. And yet, after giving so much, rural veterans often return home to fewer resources than their urban counterparts. They face long drives to access VA hospitals, limited mental health care, fewer job training opportunities, higher rates of PTSD, suicide, and opioid addiction. Many rural towns don't have enough therapists, enough social services, or even enough broadband to support telehealth. And so, after all the praise, after all the flag waving, many rural veterans are left behind by the very system they fought to defend. It's important to realise rural military service isn't just about combat or economics, it's about identity. These communities often define themselves through the lens of service. Parades on Memorial Day, volunteer fire departments made up of veterans, ROTC programs in high schools, community support groups led by military spouses. Military service in rural America becomes intergenerational memory, a binding agent between past and present, sacrifice and pride. And whether the war was fought in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan or elsewhere, rural towns have carried a disproportionate share of the burden. Urban America might talk about policy, but rural America lives the cost. Service and sacrifice aren't abstract ideas. They're names on the walls of post offices. They're folded flags given to mothers. They're missing brothers and daughters and friends. So the next time someone dismisses rural America as outdated or disconnected, remember this. They've guarded your freedoms. They've stood watch on the front lines. They've paid with their futures, sometimes with their lives. And they've done it not for spotlight, but for principle. That is rural America. And that is what makes them the unshakable backbone of this country. When we think of healthcare in America, we often picture cutting-edge hospitals in major cities, gleaming with technology, staffed by specialists and stocked with life-saving treatments. But that image doesn't hold up across the country, because in rural America, access to healthcare isn't just about affordability. It's about availability, infrastructure, and survival. This isn't a side issue. It's not a niche concern. This is a public health emergency hiding in plain sight. Rural communities across the United States are facing a healthcare crisis, one marked by hospital closures, chronic doctor shortages, poor access to preventive care, underfunded mental health services, and higher death rates from preventable diseases. In this segment, we're pulling back the curtain on this quiet catastrophe, why it's happening, who it's hurting, and what it says about how we value or fail to value the people who grow our food, defend our country, and form the bedrock of our national identity. When closures become normal, let's start with something startling. More than 190 rural hospitals in the US have shut their doors since 2005, and over 600 more are at risk of closing. This means that in some areas, people must drive 50 to 100 miles just to reach an emergency room. And when a hospital closes in a rural town, it's not just a building shutting down, it's a lifeline being severed. Consequences of hospital closures: delayed treatment for trauma, heart attacks, strokes, and labour. Job loss. Hospitals are often one of the biggest employers in rural areas. Community decline as residents move to places with better access in them. These closures aren't happening because people don't need care. They're happening because of economic strain, staffing shortages, and policy neglect. And the consequences are deadly. Now imagine a town of 8,000 people with only 1 or 2 doctors. This isn't fiction. It's the reality in large swaths of rural America. In fact, nearly 80% of rural counties are designated as medical deserts, meaning they lack adequate access to primary care, mental health services, and specialists. Why the shortage? Doctors are less likely to live where the infrastructure is weak. Medical school debt pushes young professionals toward urban, higher-paying jobs. Rural healthcare work often means longer hours and more isolation. As a result, people don't get checkups. They skip care. They self-diagnose, they wait until it's too late, and chronic illnesses that are manageable, like diabetes or high blood pressure, become time bombs. 3. Maternal health emergency. Giving birth shouldn't be a risk. Rural women, especially Black and Indigenous women, are at higher risk of dying during pregnancy and childbirth. And it's not because rural mothers are less careful, it's because maternity wards have been closed in over 50% of rural counties. There's a lack of OB-GYNs and midwives. Ambulance response times can be 20 to 60 minutes or more. That's not just inconvenient, that's life-threatening. Some pregnant women in rural communities are forced to drive hours for a routine checkup or deliver on the side of the road because they couldn't make it in time. In a developed country, this should be unthinkable, and yet it happens every single day. 4. Mental health, the invisible emergency. Mental health care is a crisis within the crisis. Rural areas suffer from higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide, widespread substance use disorders, especially opioids and methamphetamine, few or no therapists or psychiatrists within reach, stigma that discourages people from seeking help. Imagine being a veteran with PTSD living 75 miles from the nearest VA mental health clinic, or a teenager battling depression in a town with 0 school counselors. When someone in rural America says there's no one to talk to, they often mean it literally. Even when healthcare services do exist, getting to them is another obstacle. Many rural residents don't have access to public transportation, can't afford to take time off work to travel for appointments, lack broadband internet for telemedicine, a problem for nearly 1/3 of rural households. In urban areas, telehealth is a revolution. In rural areas, it's often a luxury that's unavailable. 6, higher mortality rates. Rural Americans die younger. Let's connect the dots. Because of all these structural failures, rural Americans experience higher infant mortality, shorter life expectancy, greater rates of heart disease, cancer, and stroke, more deaths from opioid overdose, alcohol-related illness, and suicide. Simply put, if you live in rural America, you are more likely to die younger and suffer more. Not because you live unhealthily, but because the system fails to protect you. 7, the cost of being forgotten. When rural America suffers from poor healthcare, the whole country feels it. Food supply becomes more vulnerable when farm workers can't stay healthy. Military readiness falters when recruitment bases are strained by health inequity. Emergency systems like fire departments and EMT crews collapse without support. And worst of all, a massive segment of our population is told, silently but clearly, your health isn't worth investing in. Healthcare is a human right, but in rural America, it's treated like an afterthought. These communities aren't just statistics. They're grandparents raising grandkids, veterans trying to heal, teenagers dreaming of futures. And they deserve better. If rural America is truly the backbone of this country, then we need to stop breaking it under the weight of policy neglect. Because a nation that doesn't care for its rural people doesn't deserve to call itself strong. Let's fix this. Let's demand more. Let's make sure everyone has a chance not just to survive, but to thrive. When you picture economic growth in America, chances are you imagine high-rise cities, financial hubs, and tech campuses. But let's rewind. Let's take a step back, out of the boardrooms and into the barns, the small shops, the factory floors, and the dusty main streets. Because there's a different economic story unfolding in rural America. One of decline, yes, but also of resilience. This isn't just about lost jobs, it's about entire ways of life hanging in the balance. In this segment, we're diving into the economic landscape of rural America, the historical forces that caused the decline, the industries that collapsed or were hollowed out, and, perhaps most importantly, the creativity, grit, and community power that keep these places going, even when the odds are stacked against them. Let's break it down. The fall of local industry. When the factories left, rural America once thrived on a diverse mix of industries. Beyond agriculture, there were textile mills in the south, automotive parts plants in the Midwest, timber and paper mills in the Pacific Northwest, coal and mining towns scattered across Appalachia. These weren't side gigs, they were economic anchors. They supported families, funded local schools, and fueled small-town economies. But beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 2000s, many of these industries collapsed due to globalization. Factories moved overseas for cheaper labor. Automation. Machines replaced human workers. Corporate consolidation. Big companies bought out local ones and centralized operations. The result? Ghost towns. Places where main streets once buzzed with activity now have boarded up windows, shuttered storefronts, and for sale signs gathering dust. Agriculture's razor-thin margins, farming but barely surviving. Well, at least farming is still strong. Yes and no. America's farmers still produce food at massive scales, but the economics of farming have changed drastically. Small family farms are disappearing. In the 1950s, there were over 5.5 million farms in the US. Today, there are fewer than 2 million, and most of the land is owned by large agribusinesses. Farmers face crushing debt, unpredictable crop prices, trade policy swings, and extreme weather events from climate change. The average farmer today is over 58 years old, and many younger people are opting out of the profession due to financial instability. Farming has become a high-risk, low-reward endeavor. Despite feeding the country, many rural farmers are barely staying afloat. Another major economic shift in rural America? The disappearance of local businesses, big box stores and corporate chains like Walmart, Dollar General and Amazon have dramatically undercut local competition by offering lower prices and more convenience, but at a massive cost. Locally owned stores can't compete and are often forced to close. Money leaves the community. Profits go to corporate headquarters, not back into the local economy. Wages are lower, hours are inconsistent, and benefits are scarce in chain retail jobs. The small town general store, the mom and pop diner, the local hardware shop, these were once pillars of rural identity. Now they're being erased in real time. For the digital divide, economic isolation in the internet age. In today's economy, broadband access is a gateway to opportunity. Remote work, e-commerce, online education, telemedicine, all of it depends on fast, reliable internet. And yet, over 22% of rural Americans still lack broadband access, according to the FCC. That's not just an inconvenience, that's economic exclusion. Without broadband, rural entrepreneurs can't launch businesses online. Students can't access virtual learning, farmers can't take advantage of precision agriculture tools, job seekers can't apply for modern employment opportunities. This is infrastructure neglect, plain and simple, and it deepens the economic divide. 5. Resilience in the face of collapse. How rural America fights back. But here's where the story shifts, because rural America isn't just a place of hardship, it's also a place of resilience, creativity, and community survival. Here's how. A. Cooperatives and mutual aid. In some areas, farmers and workers have created co-ops to pool resources, reduce costs, and sell products more fairly, reclaiming power from corporate agribusiness. B. Entrepreneurship and rural startups. There's a growing movement of rural innovation. Local breweries using homegrown hops, artisanal goods reaching global markets through Etsy, agri-tourism bringing city dwellers to small farms, renewable energy projects, wind, solar, biofuel, generating new local jobs. These aren't just side hustles, they're reimagining what rural economies can be. See? Local investment in Main Street revivals. Some towns are banding together to rebuild their economies from within, renovating historic buildings, starting community banks, hosting local markets and festivals to attract visitors, offering grants and tax incentives to new small businesses. In essence, if no one is coming to save them, they'll save themselves. Policy matters, but the policies are failing. Let's be clear. Rural America's decline wasn't inevitable. It was engineered by decades of policy decisions that favoured corporate agriculture over family farms, invested in urban infrastructure while ignoring rural broadband and roads, allowed rural hospitals to shutter with no safety net, ignored the pleas for better education, job training and public transit. What rural America needs is not charity, it needs investment, attention and justice. Finally, we have to acknowledge the emotional cost of economic decline, the loss of dignity when good jobs vanish, the fear of being left behind, the anger at politicians who only show up for votes, the pride that remains stubborn and unshakable in spite of it all. Because economic hardship in rural America isn't just about dollars, it's about identity. And that's why resilience there means more. It's not just about making money, it's about preserving a way of life. Rural America is economically hurting, but it's not broken. It's bending under the weight of systemic neglect, yet still standing through the power of community, tradition, and grit. If we're serious about building an equitable economy, we have to stop treating rural areas like relics of the past and start treating them like partners in the future. Because the backbone of America isn't just strong, it's resilient, even when ignored, and that's something worth investing in. When we talk about the environment, when we talk about conservation, climate change, sustainability, the conversation too often bypasses rural America. In popular narratives, environmentalism is often painted as the domain of urban activists, coastal elites, or scientific institutions. But that overlooks something essential. Because in rural America, the relationship between people and the land is intimate. It's generational. It's often spiritual. This is not a place where people take nature for granted. It's a place where people live with the land, not just on it. This segment is about environmental stewardship, how rural Americans care for, protect, and depend on the environment, and why their voices are critical in any conversation about the planet's future. Let's dig deep. For many rural Americans, the environment isn't abstract. It's not just something to admire on a hike or debate in a policy meeting. It's their workplace, their income, their heritage. Farmers depend on soil health, rainfall, and ecosystem balance. Ranchers rely on healthy grasslands, clean water, and resilient pastures. Fishermen in rural coastal towns rely on sustainable waters and changing ocean patterns. Loggers and foresters depend on healthy woodland management. Tribal communities have ancestral relationships with the land, spiritual, agricultural, medicinal, and ecological. The reality is, you don't have to teach most rural people why the land matters. They've staked their lives on it. One of the most powerful forms of environmental stewardship in rural America is passed down knowledge, wisdom that predates modern science but often aligns with it. Examples: crop rotation and cover cropping to preserve soil nutrients, prescribed burns by indigenous communities to manage forest growth and prevent wildfires, water conservation techniques on small farms and homesteads, integrated pest management using natural predators instead of chemicals. These are not new green ideas from the coasts. They're old truths that rural people have practiced for centuries. In fact, many family farmers have been organic or low impact long before those terms became trendy. Climate change is not a future concept in rural America. It's a present crisis. Consider the frontline impacts: droughts that kill crops and livestock, flooding that wipes out homes and fields, wildfires that devastate entire regions, unpredictable growing seasons, pests and invasive species thriving in shifting temperatures, storms and hurricanes intensifying in frequency and severity. Yet despite these threats, rural communities are often under-resourced to adapt. They don't have access to billions in climate resilience grants. They don't always get FEMA support. They're rarely consulted in national planning conversations, and yet they adapt anyway, with ingenuity, with sweat equity, with community. Many rural Americans actively participate in conservation, not because of ideology, but because of practical survival and deep-rooted love for the land. Take, for example, private landowners who place acreage in conservation easements, ensuring it won't be developed or destroyed. Farmers who create pollinator habitats, knowing bees and butterflies support their crops. Hunters and anglers who fund wildlife preservation through licenses and taxes, supporting billions in conservation annually through the Pittman-Robertson Act. Rural towns organising against corporate dumping, fracking, or pipelines that threaten their water supplies and landscapes. This is local environmentalism. It's not loud and it's not always political, but it's powerful. There is often distrust between rural communities and large environmental organisations or federal agencies. Why? Rural people have seen conservation regulations used as blunt instruments, not collaborative tools. They fear losing land rights or autonomy through federal oversight. They've experienced economic harm from top-down policies made without their input. There's cultural and political alienation. They often feel spoken at, not spoken with. But here's the paradox. Many rural people share the same goals as environmental activists. They want clean water, healthy soil, safe air, sustainable forests, protected wildlife. What's missing is trust and a seat at the table. Rural solutions are climate solutions. We need to reframe rural America as a climate partner, not just a victim or a polluter. Here's how rural innovation supports the environment. A. Regenerative agriculture builds soil carbon, reduces erosion and chemical runoff, increases biodiversity, boosts climate resilience. B. Renewable energy. Wind farms across the Great Plains, solar fields in rural deserts and farmland, biofuel production using local crops, geothermal projects in volcanic regions. These projects create jobs, support energy independence, and fight climate change. C. Sustainable forestry. Forest thinning reduces wildfire risk. Selective logging preserves ecosystems. Reforestation programs bring back native trees. D. Carbon sequestration and ecosystem services. Rural landowners can be compensated for reforestation, cover cropping, wetland restoration, grassland preservation. Let's be clear, the future of sustainability runs through rural America. You can't solve the climate crisis without them, period. Finally, there's a deeper reason rural America protects the environment. Love of place, love of tradition, love of silence, of sky, of unpaved roads, of family homesteads, of rivers where grandfathers fished and children still swim. This isn't just about utility, it's about identity. It's easy to dismiss rural people as backward or anti-science when it comes to environmental issues. But the truth is, many of them have been living the values of environmental stewardship far longer than the world gave them credit for. They don't want to save the earth for a photo op. They want to save it because it's home. Environmental stewardship in rural America is not just alive, it's essential. These communities are not environmental villains. They are often frontline heroes. Farmers, ranchers, hunters, foresters and families protecting what they love through daily choices, hard labour and quiet wisdom. So if we want a green future, a livable planet, we need rural voices. We need rural land. And we need to stop treating these communities as obstacles and start seeing them as the guardians they've always been. Because to rural America, the land isn't just property, it's everything. When we talk about politics in America, the conversation often splits along a familiar and increasingly divisive line, urban versus rural. It's portrayed as a cultural war, a war of values, a war of lifestyles. But like most binary narratives, this one is too simplistic and frankly too dangerous. Because when we reduce rural America to a red voting bloc or a caricature of conservatism or a stereotype of grievance and ignorance, we don't just insult real people, we miss the complex, layered and evolving truth of rural political identity. In this segment, we're going to look at how rural America's political power is both overstated and underappreciated, how their identity is widely misunderstood, and why bridging the gap between rural and urban narratives might be one of the most important tasks in the nation's democratic future. Let's get into it. 1. The electoral power of rural America. Real but misleading. Let's start with the numbers. 4 to 20% of Americans live in rural areas, and yet rural voters often wield outsized influence in national elections. Why? The Senate. Each state gets 2 senators, whether it's California with nearly 40 million people or Wyoming with just over 500,000. That gives smaller, often rural states disproportionate influence. The Electoral College heavily favours less populated states. Congressional redistricting, gerrymandering. Rural areas often end up with more secure or favourably drawn districts. State legislatures, often dominated by rural interests, especially in swing or conservative states. So yes, rural America punches above its weight in American politics. But here's the twist. That influence does not always serve rural communities themselves. It's a political illusion, one where rural voters deliver power to politicians, but rarely see that power invested back into their lives. Rural hospitals still close, rural schools remain underfunded, broadband access remains dismal, climate crises go unaddressed, and wages stagnate. Representation without results is not true power. It's exploitation disguised as advocacy. 2. Misunderstood identity, not just Red America. The media tends to paint rural America as a monolith, conservative, white, older, religious and hostile to progress. But this view erases entire communities and simplifies a much more diverse and dynamic population. Here's the reality. Rural America is racially and ethnically diverse. 25% of rural residents are people of color, including significant Black, Latino, Native American and Asian communities. Not all rural voters are Republican. In fact, many are independent, and younger generations are leaning more progressive. Rural Americans care about progressive issues: clean water, healthcare access, public education, infrastructure, corporate accountability, and yes, even climate change. Many rural voters are frustrated with both parties. They feel forgotten by Democrats and used by Republicans. But because media coverage so often focuses on culture war hot buttons, guns, abortion, religion, race, it ignores the economic and structural grievances that drive rural politics. Rural identity isn't built around hate. It's built around survival, around loyalty, around land, around labour, around being told you don't matter and finding ways to matter anyway. The populist pull and the betrayal behind it. There's a reason populist rhetoric lands so strongly in rural areas. When a politician says the elites don't care about you, or they left you behind, or the system is rigged against you, rural people don't hear anger. They hear truth, because they have been left behind by trade deals, automation, agricultural monopolies, plant closures, dying towns, shuttered schools. But here's the danger. Populism can mask exploitation. Once in power, many populist leaders do little to improve rural lives. Instead, they slash public programs that rural areas depend on, cut education and healthcare, deregulate industries that pollute rural environments, demonize immigrants, even in towns that rely on them for farm and factory labour. In short, populism often weaponizes rural pain without healing it. Rural Americans deserve more than slogans. They deserve solutions. The weaponization of rural values. We also have to talk about how rural values, hard work, faith, independence, patriotism, community, are constantly used as political props. Politicians love to pose in flannel shirts, speak with folksy accents, and talk about small towns like mythical heartlands. But that's not respect, that's performance. And while rural people are often told they represent real America, they're simultaneously left out of real decisions, real funding, and real policy change. This cultural romanticization, combined with material neglect, creates a toxic cycle. Rural pride is used as a tool to maintain political loyalty, while the actual communities are slowly drained of opportunity. Let's be honest, mainstream media does a terrible job covering rural America. When rural places make the news, it's either a political battleground, a site of natural disaster, or the butt of a joke. But what about stories of innovation? What about local resilience projects? What about rural entrepreneurs, artists, educators, environmentalists? What's missing is nuance. What's missing is presence. And when people don't see themselves accurately reflected in national narratives, they tune out, or worse, turn toward alternative media sources that feed conspiracy, fear, and division. The vacuum of representation is dangerous, and it has consequences. What needs to change? We cannot build a healthy democracy without rural inclusion. That means investing in rural infrastructure, broadband, roads, energy, water systems, protecting rural hospitals and expanding healthcare access, elevating rural voices in climate, education and technology conversations, listening without condescension. No more, why do they vote against their interests takes. Expanding media presence in rural towns, not just parachute journalism, but consistent embedded coverage, ailment. It also means urban America has to stop seeing rural people as the other. We are all Americans. We all want safety, dignity, opportunity, and respect. Our landscapes may differ, but our hopes do not. Final reflection for this segment. Rural America is not a static idea. It's not a Republican stronghold. It's not a whitewashed fairy tale. It is a dynamic, evolving, deeply human place, filled with people who are often invisible in national discourse, yet indispensable to the nation's soul. If we want to fix the dysfunction in American politics, we have to start by understanding rural identity in all its complexity and restoring real political power to rural communities, not just at the ballot box, but in policy, culture, and public investment. The backbone of America deserves better than slogans. It deserves a voice. It deserves trust. It deserves truth. Let's start giving it that. So here we are. We've travelled through the fields and front porches of rural America. We've looked beneath the surface of headlines, beyond voting maps, past the stereotypes, and into the soil where real life grows, where grit is not a slogan but a way of life. And now it's time to face a simple but uncomfortable truth. We don't value rural America the way we should. We exploit it, we mythologize it, we politicize it, but we rarely listen to it, we rarely invest in it, and we almost never honor it with the respect it deserves. This isn't just about geography, it's about justice. To value rural America is not just to appreciate the views from a winding country road or a story about small-town charm. It's about recognizing injustice where it hides in plain sight. When a rural hospital closes and the next closest emergency room is 90 miles away. when farmers can't compete with corporate giants and are forced to sell land that's been in the family for generations, when students in small town schools are denied basic resources because their zip code isn't worth the investment, when the people who feed us, fuel us, fight for us and ground us are treated as if they are backwards, disposable or irrelevant, that isn't just cultural negligence, that's moral failure. Because the American experiment, this wild, imperfect, evolving dream of a nation, doesn't work if we leave our backbone to rot. We talk so much about innovation and disruption. We celebrate billionaires and influencers, but we don't talk enough about the people who live close to the earth, who wake up before sunrise, who fix what's broken with what they've got, who know how to raise animals, repair engines, grow food, and raise children with values carved out of faith, humility, and work ethic. There's dignity in dirt. There's value in the slow, the steady, the rooted, and the real. And we should be building bridges, not just metaphorically, but literally, that connect rural life to opportunity, to respect, and to the rest of the country's cultural and economic future. Rural is not the past, it's part of the future. Let's stop talking about rural America like it's an echo of the past. It is a partner in our future. Rural land is where we'll grow the sustainable food of tomorrow. It's where we'll harness clean energy, wind, solar, and innovation tied to the land. It's where new models of small business, local governance, and community care can show the rest of the country what resilience really looks like. And maybe most importantly, it's where we rediscover something America's been losing fast: connection. Because in small towns, people still show up for each other, still knock on neighbours' doors, still vote in school board elections, still know the names of their mail carrier, their grocer, their mechanic, and their mayor. That's not quaint. That's powerful. That's democracy in motion. That's society intact. We can't afford to keep getting this wrong. If we keep treating rural America as a political puzzle piece, if we keep patronising it with down-home rhetoric but no real resources, if we keep failing to deliver healthcare, infrastructure, education and climate resilience to millions of people who literally hold the land together, then we will break the very spine that keeps this country upright, and by the time we realise what we've lost, it may be too late to recover it. What does valuing the backbone really mean? It means funding rural hospitals like lives depend on them, because they do. It means upgrading internet access and education in rural counties, because knowledge isn't an urban luxury. It means respecting rural labour, paying it fairly, protecting it legally, and celebrating it culturally. It means making policy with rural voices at the table, not just about them behind closed doors. It means reframing the national story to include and centre the people we've left behind. Not out of charity, not out of guilt, but because they've earned it, with their labour, their love, and their legacy. Rural America is not dying. It's adapting, it's resisting, it's redefining itself in quiet, defiant ways, far from cable news panels and social media trends. But it can't do it alone. It's time for the rest of us, especially those in seats of power, policy and privilege, to show up. Not just with speeches, not just with cameras, but with real investment, real curiosity and real humility. Because you don't survive a nation's storms without your backbone. And rural America, tired as it may be, invisible as it may feel, has been holding us upright this whole time. Let's start acting like it. This has been the Cluster Fudge Podcast. I'm Alexandra. Thank you for listening. And thank you to every rural listener out there who keeps this country running in ways most will never see, but all of us. Oh, we see you, we hear you, and we are better because of you.